All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Powered by Education live Q&A session. While we're waiting for everyone to come in, I did want to take a second and talk about our Powered by Education school choice groups. These are groups for parents and those interested in other school options to join and get to know other families in their state. We can put a link this uh, in this video. So go check those out. Join. It's a great community. It's a lot of fun. So just wanted to drop that in there before we get started. Um, Today we have Carrie McDonald. She is a mother of 4 children and an education writer out of Massachusetts. And she is the unschooling master. Um, I don't personally know a lot about home unschooling, so this is going to be a really great interview. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you, and you can tell us a little bit more about what unschooling is and how you got started with that.
Sure, great. I'm glad to be with you today. I first became interested in homeschooling when I was an undergraduate in college in the late 1990s. And I was an economics major, but an education minor. And so for a senior seminar, I had an opportunity to do an independent research project and was curious about alternative education. And I had a classmate of mine who had family members who were homeschooling nearby and who welcomed me into their home. And I didn't really know anything about homeschooling. I went to K to 12 public school. Homeschooling itself was not anywhere near the mainstream option that it is today. In fact, it had only become fully legally recognized in all 50 states a few years prior by 1993. So there were fewer than a million, there were about 800,000 homeschoolers at the time in 1998, 1999. So it was definitely not the movement that it has become. But I was curious about this. And so when I shadowed this homeschooling family, I was completely enchanted by what I saw. The learning was very personalized, very tailored to the child's interests. There was this sense of real community, authentic community immersion, sort of not the sort of static and artificial socialization that you get in school, but really an authentic immersion in the people, places, and things of their community. And it was really striking for me. It was particularly interesting because at that same time, that semester, I was also doing a student teaching practicum in a local second grade classroom at a public elementary school. And the contrast between the two learning environments could not have been more different. Sort of this kind of top-down command and control type of environment I saw in the public school compared to this very nurturing, personalized learning environment that I saw in the homeschooling family. So that whole experience prompted me to go to graduate school in education policy at Harvard, where I became more interested in alternative education and specifically alternatives to school. So not just alternative schools, but alternatives to school. But it wasn't really until about a decade later when I became a mom and was looking at education options for my own kids that I revisited homeschooling, which of course had ballooned in size to nearly 2 million at the time, and now over 2 million homeschoolers in the US. And kind of gravitated slowly to this idea of unschooling or self-directed education, which seeks to not replicate school at home. So if we think about kind of traditional homeschooling, you have a top-down curriculum that you're teaching in a way that's similar to what happens in schools. But unschooling really challenges the whole idea about schooling as the appropriate mode of education and really seeks to disentangle education from schooling and have it be a much more bottom-up experience that's driven by the child's interests and passions.
That's awesome. I remember back when I first started in like my early grades after kindergarten, I was homeschooled and then went to a couple of different other school options. So I, yeah, I love homeschooling, and it was great. I have a couple of questions. So how did you kind of talked about how you first got started, but how was that like with your own students and your own kids and finding um, what works best for them, and how did you get started with them?
Right. So, what's nice about the homeschooling community now is that because homeschooling is so much more mainstream, it's really a valid education option for families. There are a tremendous amount of resources available to homeschooling families. Even for families, for example, where there may be two working parents, there are now community resource centers, self-directed learning centers. I work with an organization, national nonprofit called the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, which helps to kind of connect families to these self-directed learning centers where kids can go part-time or full-time, depending on families' needs and interests. That sort of enables homeschooling and particularly unschooling to be more accessible to more parents. So there are a tremendous amount of resources in the community, museums and libraries and local organizations that cater to homeschooling families with lots of programs and activities. So what happens with unschooling is, you see what your kids are interested in, and then you connect them as parents to the resources in their community, both live resources, real resources, as well as this sort of burgeoning digital resources, virtual resources. So I can give you one sort of recent example. My oldest child is my daughter, Molly, who's 11, and she is very interested in, right, currently in Korean language and culture. She began taking martial arts classes last fall. On one of our, community walks around the neighborhood, there was a new martial arts studio that opened, and she said, "What's this? This is so intriguing." She went in, talked to the people there, wanted to do a trial class, and really fell in love with martial arts. She does that 3 days a week, along with her younger sister. But through that, became really interested in Korean culture and language and music and history, and so has been seeking out Korean classes, doing online language learning programs, as well as other classes with instructors on Korean culture and history. So that's just one example of something that's really driven by the child, with the adult facilitating that. And again, that can be in a home environment through homeschooling and unschooling that's family-centered, or it could be in one of these self-directed learning centers available in a community where other adult facilitators can make this happen for kids.
That's awesome. So there are a lot, through my personal experience and through researching, there's a lot of backlash and misconceptions and myths about unschooling and homeschooling. Could you talk a little bit about those and how a lot of times they're not true, and talk about sort of the structure that you have, and it's not just like every man for himself kind of
Right.
school. There's lots of structure still, even though you're not in a brick and mortar setting. So could you just talk about some of those myths that are out there about homeschooling and unschooling?
Sure, yeah. So I'll start with homeschooling. I mean, there's sort of the caricature of homeschooling, of this idea that kids are sitting around the kitchen table with their workbooks and the curriculum, and the parent, usually the mother, is there, um, you know, going through the curriculum and telling them what they need to learn, and essentially replicating school at home. I think even in a very traditional homeschooling families, that caricature, is not factual. It's not real. I think that there's much more authentic immersion, as I said, in the larger community. Lots of opportunities for kids to get together with other homeschoolers, as well as neighborhood kids. Homeschoolers are actively involved in, what we would think of as after school programs in their community, sports programs, and other activities. So I think this sort of stereotype about homeschoolers being insular and disconnected is really the opposite. And in fact, research has shown that homeschoolers are tremendously connected to their community, or actively involved, even more so than their schooled peers, in volunteer opportunities in their community and other kinds of interactions throughout their broader neighborhoods. So that is one myth that I think is sort of easily abolished. But with unschooling, yeah, there's this idea that, oh, kids are just running wild, that it's sort of this Lord of the Flies environment with unschooling, and kids are running the show. And certainly homeschoolers and unschoolers are a varied bunch, but I think generally when we think about unschooling and self-directed education, it's the children's interests that are driving the learning. So it's a bottom-up experience. It's not top-down the way school is. But it certainly involves a lot of adult effort and vigilance to connect those interests, to recognize that child's interests, and then connect those interests to the broader resources of one's community. So it's definitely not the kids running the show. And in fact, I have a forthcoming book that's being published later this year by Chicago Review Press called Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. And I interview many parents and educators. And the common thread is that, this takes a lot of adult effort. This isn't just kids running the show. There is this definite balance between freedom and responsibility on both the part of the child, the learner, and the adults that are facilitating that learning.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll definitely have someone put a link to your website and book up on the on this live page, because we definitely want some of our parents to check that out. Sorry, having a little technical difficulties. So one other question I have is about sort of the setup and legal aspects of, not legal, but like some aspects about homeschooling and unschooling, about some of the technical things like keeping records, and how do you register your kids with that type of program and all that. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you've done that with your kids and how you recommend setting that up for your family.
Right. So as I said earlier, homeschooling is legal in all 50 states. And regulations vary by state, and in some cases by city and town within those states. So some states there are no reporting requirements. In other states, there are more significant reporting requirements. And some states even have testing requirements for homeschoolers. So it really varies by state. In Massachusetts, we don't have a state homeschooling statute. We have case law, as it occurs in other states as well, that sort of guides the legality of homeschooling, empowering parents to be responsible for their child's education. And so we report to our own school district, our own town, giving them a yearly education plan, sort of discussing the various books the kids will read or the things that we'll do. And unschooling as an approach of homeschooling, would certainly fit into that.
Yeah, that's all right. That's great. One last question from me. I was looking on your site last night, and I saw the D-School workforce that was linked to your website. Could you talk a little bit about that? It seemed really interesting, and I'd love for some of the parents watching and who will watch this later on to know more about that. So if you could just tell us more about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so, I think one of the reasons that I'm really passionate about unschooling and self-directed education is I think that, not only does it create a really exciting learning environment for children, but it's also sort of where our economy is going. So if we think about the jobs of the future, most of which have probably not even been invented yet, and many of the jobs we currently have will continue to be done by robots. The real key is to distinguish humans from our artificial antipodes, right? So that we really have to think about what makes humans different, special. What are these sort of human characteristics that can't be replicated in a robot? And those are things like creativity, curiosity, ingenuity, inventiveness, entrepreneurial spirit. these are the kinds of qualities that robots, at least in the near future, aren't really going to be able to match. And so if we think about an industrial schooling model that's top-down, that's in terms of its compulsory nature, really, a 19th century artifact that hasn't changed all that much in the past 150 or so years, we have an entirely new economy now that is not at all being suited by a top-down compulsory system of mass schooling. And we need to be encouraging these kinds of qualities like curiosity and creativity that kids naturally have. We don't need a curriculum for this. Young children, humans, have these qualities innately. And they don't sort of disappear just because we get older. They are systematically dulled through a coercive system of mass schooling. And so if we can instead cultivate those qualities, not extinguish them, we will have young people who are much better prepared for an unknown future and a workforce that we cannot even imagine.
Yeah. I can definitely say some of the people I've gotten to know through homeschooling and doing online school, virtual school, through my personal career. Some of the students that have graduated from those programs are just really impressive and sharp, and not like the students who have been sort of dulled through the K through 12 brick and mortar top down curriculum and setting. So it is fascinating to see that when students aren't dulled down, how they can maximize their potential and be like super great and creative, and it's really exciting. So there are a few questions of the people watching. So we'll put those on the screen. There we go. Yes. Can we come back for a book launch whenever you
yes.
launch? We'd love to have it.
Love to be here.
I'd love to read your book and have that all around. That'd be great. That'd be super fun. Jennifer also said, what are your favorite, you might be able to see the question, what are your favorite self-directed learning centers you've seen? Do you use one?
Yeah. It's hard to pick. There's some, incredible things happening in self-directed learning centers across the country. I'll start with one of the oldest is a learning center called Open Connections outside of Philadelphia. It was probably the first self-directed learning center, initially created really in the early 80s as kind of a self-directed preschool program, but has expanded now for all ages, and is just an incredible space and has really been a model for other self-directed learning centers. I would say another one that was, again, probably one of the earlier self-directed learning centers is a place called Northstar Self-Directed Learning for Teens in Western Massachusetts. That was started by a man named Kenneth Danford, who was a former 8th grade history teacher in public schools, became completely disillusioned with what he was seeing in middle school and high school, just the sort of crushing of the creativity and spirit of his learners, and he wanted something different. So he founded Northstar in 1996, and it's helped hundreds of young people ages 12 and over escape the confines of schooling and learn differently. He received so many emails and calls from other educators and teachers who were as disillusioned as he was with what they were seeing in schools, wanting help to create their own self-directed learning centers that he did, that he founded a nonprofit called Liberated Learners in 2013 that helps educators across the country and really now in the world. In fact, they're expanding internationally to launch these self-directed learning centers in their own communities. So those are two that are just really special, that have a kind of a long legacy of supporting self-directed learning and making homeschooling and unschooling much more accessible to more families who never even imagined that homeschooling or unschooling would be on their radar. And then sort of my personal bias is a place called Parts and Crafts, just outside of Boston. My kids take some classes there. That's really more on a makerspace model. The founders were sort of motivated not only by self-directed education and unschooling, but also by hacker spaces, maker spaces. So the kids are really able to tinker and do a lot of programming, computer programming, and building things, getting involved in robotics and all that sort of thing. So there's just a wide variety, and that's what makes self-directed learning centers so exciting.
I'm feeling pretty jealous. Like you're telling me all about these programs. I'm like, I want to do that.
Right.
That sounds fun. We're gonna go to another question. How do you make sure of the basics?
Right. So one of the things I say is, parents have an obligation to make sure that their kids are literate and numerate. And I think that that's an obligation whether your kids are homeschooled or in regular school. I think it's the parents' responsibility to ensure that their children are highly educated. And so, I think that there are just different approaches to that. One of the things I talk a lot about is that, I firmly believe, for example, that kids will naturally learn to read if they're surrounded by literacy, by books, have frequent trips to the library, are surrounded by people who appreciate literacy, read to them often, model a love of reading by reading their own books. I think that it's sort of one of those qualities of living in society that if we're surrounded by literacy, we will become literate when we're supported and given those resources. So I think that's one critical piece, is that we have to make sure as adults that we're surrounding young people, whether it's in our homes or in these self-directed learning centers or other kinds of community resource centers, with access to these resources. And the same is true with math and other subjects, that you're not sort of sitting down and saying, okay, now it's math time, but that you have this abundance of resources in your space, in your home or in your center, that makes that accessible and interesting to kids and to all of us. So it doesn't have to be coercive. It doesn't have to be, again, what happens in school of, okay, now it's time to do this, and we're going to follow these worksheets, and we're going to have this exam. It can be much more enjoyable and much more organic. My kids have never been to school, love worksheets and workbooks because we have those in our homes. They're not, mandated to do them at certain times and in certain ways, but they love doing them because they have no mental model to think of those as something to be avoided, to think of those as being drudgery that only happens in school. Think of something like math. A lot of us have residual aversion to math because of the way we were taught in school. Unschooled kids and many homeschooled kids don't have that same aversion because there's not that coercion associated with it. It's just another resource for them to explore and discover.
That's awesome. I think we have one more question for you. There we go. Yes. Do you still have a schedule?
Yeah, interesting. I would say, we have more rhythms, learning rhythms and daily and seasonal rhythms. Things will start to pick up, certainly, as I'm sure for, many of your viewers come fall. Even though, the kids don't go back to school, a lot of their classes are seasonal, their activities are seasonal. I find that particularly as my kids get older, they have more activities and more things they're interested in. And so we have a schedule that's sort of based around those classes, those interests, those activities. But yeah, it varies again by the time of the year and the time of the day and the week, and as well as always changing based on the kids' emerging interests.
Well, that is awesome. Thank you. This is Carrie McDonald. Thank you again for coming on live with us and answering some of the questions we had about homeschooling and unschooling. We'd definitely love to leave your information, the link to your blog, some of the info we have on you. We'd love for some of our parents to come check out your website and see. Get a little bit more information. But thank you once again. You have I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up for right now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Glad to be here.
All right. Bye-bye.